Okay, Jamie, we've got to get this straight away. There's no suggestion that the current Victor is anything but a respectable businessman. But as you alluded to earlier, he has that sort of air about him, and something that you said he's sort of happy to cultivate. Now, I was speaking to a friend of mine before I did this interview, and they said that they sat next to Victor at Entourage in a restaurant on a racing day, a
Yeah,
few years ago. And he
yeah.
said at least one of them was the scariest man he'd ever seen. Is that something you could relate to?
I can understand that, and I think I have an inkling of who that might have been. Yes, it's a funny old thing, isn't it? I mean, gangsters retire sometimes from their line of work, shall we say, and on other occasions they like to spend their money in sporting pursuits and gambling pursuits like everybody else. Um, I think the other thing with Victor is if you look back to the 40s and the 50s, you had people like the American actor George Raft was very involved with the mafia in America and very involved with the gambling industry, with casinos in the Bahamas. And then when the mafia backed the reopening of the Colony Club in Berkeley Square, George Raft was the front man for that. And all of that aspect of casino gambling was conducted, in beautifully dressed clothes, lovely interiors, good food and drink. And you had that cross section of people that mingled, high life, high society, and people from the movies, people from sporting worlds, and the underworld. And it was just the way that they lived. And I think young Victor inherited that aura from his dad and his grandfather, and he always really rather enjoyed it. As you say, in terms of his bookmaking, he was going to monitor what his clients were doing, like any smart bookie would. He was going to be conscious of the moves made by particular people, particularly if they were professional gamblers or they were gamblers who were known to have good sources of information. Um, but he played the game, but yeah, he would socialize with all kinds of those people. But then he'd equally be mixing with top trainers, top owners, the Queen's representatives, and people like that. He sponsored at Ascot for years, and the relationship he had with the authorities there and the Ascot authority was first class.
Okay, there are people familiar with the betting ring, especially if they've been there for a few years, who recognise some parallel bookmaking family lines that grew up
Yes.
alongside the Chandlers. Were there any sort of other stories that you sort of thought, this could be another book here in the course of your?
I think definitely some. I think one of the great ones is John Banks, the great Scottish bookmaker. There's only one bank in Scotland, that's John Banks. And all the way that he used to have his feud with Ladbrokes, with Cyril Steen, when John Banks called a racehorse Greenwich Meanstein, and he was told he couldn't call it that, so he changed it to Adorable Cyril. And he loved taking the mickey out of Cyril Steen. But John, and now you've got his son Jeff, you've got people like the White family, you've got the Laurie Wallace family, you've got fantastic Irish racing dynasties, the Graham family, for example. They're the people who have the fund of stories and the memories of fantastic characters and personalities. And again, I think the thing that's so interesting about them all is that they took bets from all kinds of and classes of and backgrounds of people, because racing was somewhere where all levels of society would meet. They would intersect at Epsom or at Newmarket or at Cheltenham or Aintree. And again, that's something that you feel we've slightly lost, as a society. We've lost the love of it, the fun of it, the fact that everybody loves a gamble and a bit of racy company. And we don't want the whole thing to be too sanitized and respectable. It takes a lot of the charm out of it.
Yeah, no, I saw your books had a lot of positive feedback. I did see a comment on social media where somebody described a few things in the book as sanitized. So how much material did you have to keep untold?
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I think I know who that was as well, somebody who once worked for Victor for a while. I mean, again, the point here is that it's an authorized biography. So there were some areas that I couldn't go to. I had to accept that when I agreed to write it. It's no secret, I think, that we had a lot of trouble getting this to the point of publication. And one of the reasons for that is that while Victor was very happy to talk about the turbulence that overtook his personal life, which a lot of people who know him and know the game will be aware of, in the years following 2004, 5, 6, 7, it was very difficult for us to tell the whole story at this juncture about the eventual sale of the business to his former partner. And when we got close to completing the book the first time around, first of all, I was knocked out of the running for a while with health issues, which was all rather unwelcome drama. And so we couldn't do it in 2019. Then in 2020, it was going to be published by the Racing Post and Racing Post Books imprint, who did Doped and Blown. But then they kind of folded, or they pretty much made it clear that they felt unable to carry on with the project. And this was partly because we were starting to get rather intimidating letters from lawyers talking all about subjects like breaches of confidentiality and client confidentiality and breaches of privacy, and saying that it would not be regarded as acceptable if we delved into the details of the financial position of the company at the time that Victor sold it, and in the years leading up to that sale, and the difficulties that he was encountering. And we were pretty much kind of warned off. So we had to make a decision in the end, whether we went with the book up to the point of his escape from the French gambling police at Longchamp in 2007, which is very funny, and whether we would leave it there for now and make it clear that there would be more to follow, which is why the last words are to be continued. And he's absolutely determined to bring it up to the present day. And I very much hope that we will do that in the next few years. But it's an area which we can't really venture into without clear guidelines being established legally. And I think that's probably all I can say about it at this juncture.
Okay, there's something you do say a lot about in the book is other people's betting, and those people are named, and some of those people are still alive. Were there
Yes.
any qualms about that?
We had some of the people who are named who are betting, they had no qualms about it. I did have to change the names of some of the Far Eastern characters, not least because we don't want them turning up. Victor's down in Spain. He's got a ranch practically down there. You know, you'd be aware of them coming. It'd be like a Western. But I don't really want to see them. I don't want to bump into them here in Bath or at Sandown, members of the Triads, etc. So we had to change some of those names. But some of the old clients who used to bet with him, they were perfectly happy to have their names mentioned. And then there was some slightly petty stuff about people betting at Cheltenham, where anybody who reads the chapters about Cheltenham at the beginning, talking about certain Irish punters, it's not very difficult to put two and two together and imagine who they are, but they wanted their names taken out of it, so we took their names out of it. You know, there are Victor's clerk, former clerk Bill Tighe, most lovely man, wonderful man, great knowledge of racing, and he used to keep the old ledger, you know, writing all the bets down by hand in those days before computers. Bill had so many wonderful stories to tell about clients, some of which we had to delete. And as you rightly say, there are very funny stories of Victor's about trying to get paid by clients who owed the firm money. I mean, you know, many big bookmakers, Ben will be familiar with this, one of their constant problems, particularly in the old days when gambling debts weren't legally enforceable, was how do we get paid? And for all the jokes about, you know, breaking legs and all this sort of thing, by and large, Victor always found himself pleading with people and being told, you know, the check's in the post. But there was one funny instance with one guy who I know it was, but we can't name him. But this man was flaunting his wealth around the West End, splashing the plastic around the credit cards, even though he owed Victor a substantial sum of money that had gone on for about 9 months. since they'd sort of said, well, that's it, you've got to pay. So he resorted, as he puts it, to professional assistance. And one of the characters, who may be similar to the gentleman that your friend saw sitting at the lunch or dinner in the racing setting, recommended, if that's the right word, two professional debt collectors who were, as you say, they were both ex-army gents, tough guys, big men, who were not the kind of people that you'd really want to fall out with. And they brought back to Victor a kind of settlement of a sort, shall we say, with I think they'd taken the guy's car keys and his house keys and a few other bits of personal items. And he did promptly pay up after that. But the funnier way that they used to get people to settle their debts was they had some high-rolling restaurant owners, Chinese and Italian, in the 80s. And with one of them, a Chinese guy in London, Victor used to send people to go and have lunch or dinner there. And he'd send them with a wad of cash. And at the end of the meal, when the bill came, they'd give a nice cash tip to the waiters, and then they'd take the bill and sign it Victor Chandler. And when the owner rang up, he said, "Oh, well, I thought we'd take the bill off your present debt, your position." And once he'd sent people to eat there 2 or 3 times, the owner suddenly found the money and paid up, and that was the end of it. But as I said, you'll be familiar with this, betting on credit for the bookmakers. Sometimes it can be a real nightmare. People who look to be as secure as the Bank of England, then it turns out they haven't got the money.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say. I was going to ask you about the characters that have not their real name that follows the name that you've given them. Quite humorous little monikers you found there as well. There's also a brief overlap with one of your previous subjects, Monsieur X.
Yeah, well, as you know, it was almost inevitable that Victor's father, Victor Senior, he knew Monsieur X, Patrice Desmoutis, the Frenchman who took on the PMU and had these spectacular wins on the Tiercé in the 70s, and tragically ended up committing suicide, or did he? Many of the old bookmakers who knew him reckon that he was murdered by the Corsican mafia. But Patrice used to come over and go racing in Britain at one point until he was warned off. And Victor Senior used to meet with him and sometimes used to put bets on for him, sometimes used to accept, where Patrice was doing his illegal bookmaking in France in the 50s and 60s. And if he had a big bet from somebody in Chantilly on a French horse in an era, don't forget, when the French were coming over and winning races regularly in Britain, then Victor might hedge it for him in the ring in the UK. And they were good friends and they got on very well. And indeed, Victor Senior was arrested for illegal bookmaking at Longchamp in his day. And then young Victor, was arrested for illegal bookmaking at Longchamp in 2007.
Right, now we've told a lot about this book here. So this is going to be the final part. Now people can go and buy it and learn about the rest. It's absolutely fascinating reading. Now, young Victor leaving the racecourse and the UK was, in hindsight, very visionary to the imminent demise of the betting ring as he knew it. Do you sense a mourning of it from him, or is he like ever forward thinking about the future?
I honestly think that he misses it so much, and he thinks that they were the great days, the 70s. The mid 70s, there was very little money around because it was big, economic crisis in Britain with roaring inflation and the 3-day week in 1974. That was a very tough time for bookmakers. But from the late 70s into the early 80s, when Mrs. Thatcher became prime minister and you started having the deregulation of the economy with privatization of nationalized industries, the city was opened up, you had the Big Bang, you had high rollers like Terry Ramsden, who went mad and completely did his money. But you had lots of other people who had money to bet with and gamble with and own racehorses, and they went racing regularly, and it was a popular sport. And they were the great days. And you had all those characters standing around him: Colin Webster, John Banks, Stephen Little. And it was a fantastically colourful setting. And they used to all go around to the major race meetings, the festival meetings, York, Chester, obviously Ascot and Cheltenham, the Ledger meeting. and they'd stay in similar hotels. They'd see each other in the evenings. It all overlapped. It was a terrific camaraderie. And I think he feels that that was the golden age. And obviously the introduction of betting exchanges and of computers. Victor's not a mug. He wouldn't be, he realizes you can't uninvent the wheel. He's not suggesting we can go back in time. He wouldn't want to be a dinosaur if he was in business now as a bookmaker. He's had shares in a company called Bet Lion, which is mainly a telephone betting business in East Africa. He realized that online gambling was the future, but as an individual and as a racing lover, he really misses and laments the old days. He feels that, wish they could come back.
Okay, Jamie, now being an author, you've no doubt got something else on the boil. Can you briefly tell us what's next for you?
Yep, I'm working on a new project, which is provisionally called Bandit Country. And it's a story, a non-fiction book again, and it's about the changes in gambling in Britain in the 60s. Not just because the Betting and Gaming Act of 1960, it legalized betting shops, of course, betting shops, but it also paved the way for a boom for a period of years in casinos and gambling clubs and high-end gambling. And it also made it possible for slot machines, one-armed bandits, to be reintroduced or introduced on a huge scale in Britain. And this is a story of two Londoners, Vincent and Michael Lavalio, who got kicked out of London by the Cray twins in the 50s and went up to Newcastle in the northeast. And they sold reconditioned gaming machines and slot machines that they were getting from a company run by the mafia who had offices in London. And they sold them to the miners' welfare committees and the working men's clubs in the northeast for about 3 times more than they were worth. And then they diversified into having nightclubs on Tyneside, and they made a fortune and they had a wonderful life. And then it all went terribly wrong when one gentleman who was collecting for them was found shot dead in the back of his Jag underneath a bridge in a mining village in Durham in January 1967. It became known as the one-armed bandit murder, and that's at the heart of the story.
You do like to live in the dark side, Jamie, don't you? Anyway,
I do enjoy it.
well, we should look forward to that one. And anybody that's not read it, I can't recommend the book on Victor Chandler enough. Put Your Life on It, subtitled. Thank you ever so much, Jamie, for talking to us. And
thank you very much, Simon. It's a pleasure as always.